Professor Frances Rosenbluth, our guest today. We are very honored to have you here. Professor Rosenbluth is Deputy Provost for the Social Sciences and Faculty Development at Yale University. She's a comparative political economist with research interests in war and constitutions, Japanese politics and political economy, and the political economy of gender. She's the author of numerous articles and book chapters, and Professor Rosenbluth has written several books, including The Politics of Oligarchy, Institutional Choice and Imperial Japan, Japan's Political Marketplace and Financial Politics in Contemporary Japan, and Japan Transformed Political Changes and Economic Reform. And she's also the author of Women, Work and Power, the Political Economy of Gender Inequality. Professor Rosenbluth, again, thank you so much for your time, for your kind attention. I will pass the word to you now, and please be very welcome to the University of São Paulo Faculty of Law. This is a great opportunity for us. My name is Diogo, and Carolina, who's the person who at the first moment had the idea to invite you, is here. She's going to talk to you, and as well as Beatriz. Carolina and Beatriz are PhD candidates who are helping me a lot with this course, to whom I'll be very and I'll be forever grateful. Thank you, Frances.
Well, thank you for having me, even though I would rather be there in person. It's nice to see your faces on the screen. I'm used to Zoom. I'm not used to the Google format. So I sent the slides to, is Carolina or Beatrice going to run the slideshow for me?
Yes, I'm going to do it, Frances. This is Carolina.
Oh, okay.
Frances, would you mind if we record?
It's fine. Yes, of course. I'm happy for that. Yes.
Okay, so we are recording. Nós estamos gravando, pessoal. Por favor, saibam. Okay. So Carolina will pass the slides.
Okay, great. So are they going to appear on my screen also? Yeah. Okay. So tell me when you're ready. I'm ready. If you could put the slides. Great. Okay. So we can start with the next picture. If you put it on slideshow, so we don't need to see all of the things coming up on the side.
It's a second, because
yeah.
Now can you see the presentation?
Yes, that's great. Okay, thank you so much. And so can you then turn it to the next slide? So I just want to tell you briefly what the plan of the slideshow is. It covers a lot of territory, but I want to keep it brief so we have lots of time for questions. So the first thing I'm going to say is very much influenced by American elections. That when parties are weak, it is very hard for female politicians to compete on even terms with men for lots of reasons. So we know that party systems that are disciplined and that campaign on the basis of a party platform are better for female political representation. There are more females in those kinds of systems, such as Scandinavia. We also know that party systems that compete on the basis of platforms are able to take long-term policy point of view and
I'm sorry.
That's okay. And so that was a beautiful picture. Was that the Amazon? Brazilian Amazon. I hope it's safe. So the longer term view is possible when parties compete on the basis of a long-term reputation, and voters can trust a party with a long-term reputation, but not individual politicians who come and go. And then the third thing I want to talk about is more of a legal issue, which is what policies actually do work for shrinking the gender wage gap. And we know that in Scandinavia, there's very good take-up of parental leave. The problem is that when women are more likely to be the ones who take leave, firms have the expectation that women are a bad bet. So in terms of best policies, it's important not only for governments to pay for the leave. In other words, if a government orders or mandates by law that a firm pay for the leave, that's not good enough. The government actually has to pay for the leave. But not only that, the government also has to pay for the person replacing the person taking the leave. So this is my radical proposal on which I will end today. But let's go back to the beginning then. So Carolina, if you can show the next slide. This is a picture showing how the gender wage gap is shrinking over time in the United States. So you can see that there is an upward, can you see this here? Can you see my cursor? You can't see my cursor. Okay. So you can see that the gender wage gap has shrunk by cohort, meaning that with each passing generation, women are doing better. But there's one other thing that I want you to see in this picture, which is even though they're starting off at a better place, there is a drop-off. And I wonder if this were a live discussion, I would ask you to think about why there's that drop-off. And for this most recent cohort, it hasn't happened yet, but whether you think it probably will happen. And so I'm looking at the pictures of you on the slide, but I can't hear you. So I'm just going to give away the punchline. And you probably know this is because of children. Once women have children, they cut back their effort, their hours, their trajectory, their commitment to the job, and or firms expect that to continue. And so women are not really competing on an equal footing still, even though it's getting better. Okay, Carolina, next slide, please. All right, so now female political representation. This is somewhat different in that some countries are doing tremendously better over time, the Scandinavian countries at the top, but there are other countries that have more of a flat line, including the United States. The United States is not great on this dimension. And so next slide, Carolina. One explanation for the difference over these countries is that proportional representation systems, if they are closed list representation, open list does not have this effect, but closed list representation systems where there are two stable groups of parties, center left and center right, competing for the sort of average median voter, do best for female representation. The mixed member system, this is countries like Germany or many others that copied Germany. A mix of proportional representation and single member districts do less well. And when you break it down, you can see that they're doing less well in the district portion than in the proportional part of the ballot, even for the same voters. And the district-based systems do the most poorly. And it's not so much that it's a district-based system. For example, UK does better than the US. It's more that district-based systems often have weak parties where individuals are campaigning as individuals, and women are less likely to be in the networks with high income. The more money matters, the less well women do. Okay, next slide, Carolina. In the United States, something that is quite striking is that women who are Republicans do the worst. And I'm going to suggest to you that this is because the Republican Party relies more on money than the Democratic Party. The Republican Party is a party of low taxes, but it's also, Carolina, if you can show the next slide. It's also because in the United States, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party both have become weaker, which makes money more important than ever. This is a picture of the decline in competitive seats in US House elections from 1872. So this is long in coming. What it means is that because of gerrymandering and demographic movements so that people move into communities that are more congenial to them. For example, cities have become more liberal and the countryside has become more conservative. There are fewer and fewer seats that are up for grabs between the parties. And next slide, please, Carolina. This is a picture of the, let's just call it the, it's a rough proxy of partisan views or if you like, class views between the Democrats and the Republicans. The Republicans are red, Democrats are blue. And you hear a lot about US polarization, but I want to draw your attention to something else. If these parties were polarized, they would look like a single peak far away from each other. But look at the red curve. This is flat and wide. It's spread out. What that means is that within the Republican Party, there are a very wide range of views, and therefore they can't really compete on policies. Instead of competing on policies, they say, we don't like immigrants, or we want gun laws. I mean, we want gun freedom, or we don't like abortion. So the Republican Party has been unable to put forward policies to replace Obamacare. That's just one example. The reason I'm suggesting here from this figure is that the Republicans towards the middle are moderate. The Republicans to the far right are not moderate, and they cannot actually agree on a replacement for Obamacare, the American Care Act. All right, so next figure, please. These look like amoeba, but what they are is a visualization of how far the Republican Party, I have this for the Democratic Party too, but just for the sake of sticking with gender here, I want to focus on the Republican Party. On the y-axis is the candidate political values from very conservative to very liberal on a range of policies. And what you see from 2000 to 2018 is that the yellow dots, which represent incumbents, have clustered at the bottom, and the blue dots are clustering at the top. The blue dots are challengers. And what the challengers are doing, if you could draw a line through the middle of these bubbles, the challengers are pulling the party more towards the right, which is at the top end of this score. So I know that's complicated, but what this shows is that because the competition in the United States within the Democratic and Republican parties occur in safe seats, and there are more and more of these safe seats, the parties have become more extreme. And when they're more extreme, they're unable to agree within and among themselves on policies that voters in the middle would actually want to see implemented. So the United States is an example of a weak party system where money has become more important, and money is used to buy television ads that focus on non-policy, that focus on identity or social issues that the party actually has no intention or ability to pass. Okay, so next slide, Carolina. And Diogo, do you want us to pause for questions as we're going, or do you prefer to wait? I'm happy either way.
It's up to you, Frances. It's
I
good
think,
that...
okay, I think I probably said a lot of confusing things, and I'm happy to hear questions now or later.
Okay, let's open to questions. People now know that they can ask questions if they want. Otherwise, we can do it when you finish. Okay.
Okay, so if you could just keep track, if you could be the moderator from the standpoint of seeing raised hands and just interrupt me, I would be happy to. Okay, great. Okay, so this picture shows, this red line here is the decline in the percentage of win probability of women candidates in the Republican Party. Well, the red, it means Republican. So as the seat becomes safer for Republicans, women Republicans are less likely to win. That may be confusing, and it's not intuitive. The argument, the reason is that these safe seats have most of the competition within the parties. And as the seats, more and more seats in the United States have become safe seats, the competition within the parties is more extremist. It has pushed the parties apart, but it also has pushed quite a lot of distance within the party because not all of the seats are safe seats. We can keep going if you want, because I know that's a lot of American politics, but it's the explanation for why, if you look at Republican versus Democratic women, there are so many fewer Republican women in the United States. Okay, next slide, Carolina. All right, so unlike the United States, there are some strong party systems. Many of them are in Northern Europe, and they tend to produce better policies. So what do I mean by that? So Carolina, next slide, please. This is a piece you may have seen. It was just out in August by a couple of economists who do an empirical study on the effects of investment in early childhood education and care on economic growth. And their argument actually doesn't start with early childhood education and care. They compare lots of different policies that governments could pursue, but they find that early childhood education and care, in fact, is the best predictor of long-term economic growth. This is somewhat puzzling, perhaps, but the argument is that when human capital is widely available for everybody in the society and the economy can adapt much better to changes in technology without leaving large groups of people behind. as in the United States today. So next slide, please, Carolina. This is a very messy slide with poor visualization, so don't hurt your eyes trying to see it. But I've put circles around the two factors that I want you to look at. So what is this slide saying? It's the dependent variable is ECEC spending, that is government spending on early childhood education and care among OECD countries. The independent variable, the causal variable, is party systems, which we proxy with public campaign financing. So when individual candidates are not raising their own money, but the government is limiting the amount of spending, and it is the same for all the parties, we're taking that as a proxy for a stronger party-based competition rather than individual politicians. The second one, EFF, is effective number of parties. So in Europe, you probably know that as the percentage of industrial jobs goes down relative to all employed, and more people are employed in precarious jobs, there is a lot of discontent, which finds its effects in increasing the number of parties. A lot of people who have lost their jobs or who are downwardly mobile, who are afraid of losing jobs, who are angry, are moving to parties on the far right or the far left. So there's less coherence in the middle of the political system. The system becomes more fragmented. And that is bad for ECEC spending for reasons that primaries in a weak party system like the United States is bad for ECEC spending. In other words, parties cannot compete with one another on the basis of platforms, but instead they're competing as individuals or as very small and more radical parties. Okay, so I'm going to move to the next slide, Carolina. So finally, I would like to think about gender income equality, which we started with when I showed you those cohort gender inequality figures. So what policies actually work for reducing the income gap between men and women? So Carolina, if you could show this. The first thing is a caveat. This scatter plot, if the relationship between women in politics, that is women in parliamentary positions on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, women's share of management as a proportion of women in the labor force, if it was just a matter of culture or attitudes towards women, there would be a 45-degree line here. It would be a strong relationship. But instead, we see, if anything, a 45-degree line in the opposite direction. So this is a puzzle. It means that there is a very, very poor relationship between women in parliament and women in business management. If anything, it's a negative relationship. So I hope that puzzles you. So let's turn to the next slide, Carolina. I'll come back to that later, why there should be a negative relationship. But let me just say very briefly that in Scandinavia, where female political representation is very high, ECEC spending is very high. Unfortunately, there are relatively few women in managerial positions in the private sector. In other words, all good things don't necessarily go together. There is some policy failure, even in Scandinavia. So I want to spend the rest of our time thinking about what that policy failure is. What we do know is that women in Scandinavia take most of the leave that is offered, and it's very generous leave. It's better parental leave than any other part of the globe. And so we think, they are leading the way. And it's true. I think they're leading the way. They're also leading the way in trying to get men to take leave. So in this picture on the slide, it's the men's proportion of parental leave days taken. And it's an old, it's 6 years ago. So in Sweden now, the percentage is closer to high 30%. So it's going up, it's steadily going up, but nowhere in the world, not even in Iceland, is it 50%. And as long as women are more likely to take leave than men, if this were an open, if it were easy for us to communicate, I would ask you why you think firms would be less inclined to hire or promote women. If women are more likely to take leave than men, even if the government pays for the leave, which it has begun to do, you'd think, okay, they've solved the problem. There's still one cost that women represent to a firm that has not been taken care of, and that is the replacement cost for when she leaves. When a woman takes a few weeks off or a few months off, the person who is stepping in to do her work is not paid for by anybody. And therefore, it is paid for by the women themselves in the form of lower wages or lower probability of being hired in those positions. Next slide, please, Carolina. So this is what we call statistical discrimination when a firm calculates that a woman is a bad bet. It becomes implicit bias if they're not really investigating the likelihood, but they just have stereotypes. So this slide just repeats what I've already said, that requiring firms to pay for parental leave is an unfunded mandate that firms will pass on to women by hiring women less often and paying them less. Even if there are laws against this, it's pretty easy to say, well, that woman actually wasn't of equal value. And this creates an incentive to be biased against women so that it can make a stronger legal case. That's a big irony. And so until men and women each have a 50% chance of taking parental leave, the government needs not only to pay for the leave, but it also needs to pay the replacement costs. And I saw this up close. Diogo mentioned that I was the deputy provost for faculty development as well as deputy provost for social sciences. In the wet bench sciences at Yale, which are mostly in the medical school, wet bench sciences being biology and biology related. Wet bench means you have to work with live cultures. If you take time off, somebody has to be there to keep your cultures alive. So even though the United States has a national science fund to help pay for postdocs, it's not good enough to pay for parental leave. The women scientists told me they would love to hire female postdocs, but they don't feel they can because female postdocs are likely to represent a cost to them. They have to use their own research money, or even if they're using government money, it means that they have less to use for something else. So even the women scientists are more likely to hire male scientists in the wet bench postdoctoral positions because of this issue. All right, so next slide, please, Carolina. We're at the end. And the overall message, especially if you look at countries like Sweden and Iceland, is that gender equality has advanced quite a lot. But if you peel back the layers a little bit, you see that the female employment is disproportionately in the government sector, where the employer doesn't have to worry about profits. In the private sector, where employers do worry about profits, they are still likely to avoid hiring and promoting women, even in these very, very gender advanced countries like Sweden and Denmark. So I think it's quite a striking fact, and it's not until they can actually use government money to pay replacement costs that they will close the gender gap. Now, you all, especially those of you who are in law, can tell me how contentious that would be in the law courts, because there are people who don't have children who are going to say that this is unfair, and that if the government is trying to level the playing field, this is going too far. So I'd like to hear from a legal point of view what you think about that. But in conclusion, strong party systems can help to offer good policies like ECEC, early childhood education and care, but they have not yet seen this blind spot, or maybe just a very, very difficult policy to pursue because of the perceptions of fairness and that will result. All right, so I am very much looking forward to hearing your comments and questions. And we can go back to the pictures if as appropriate.
Thank you so much, Frances. This was excellent. Very, very striking indeed, because it's somehow counterintuitive, right? That leave policies cause this type of effect. It's not obvious at all, not for me at least. I didn't know about this. So thank you so much for bringing these new arguments and claim. So let's open the floor to questions. Please feel completely and entirely free to raise questions, both in written or orally. Don't be shy.
And also, if you don't feel comfortable in asking in English, you can ask in Portuguese and we can translate so that Frances can understand.
And while people are deciding on how to phrase their questions or comments, you should also feel free to email me. My email address is frances.rosenbluth@yale.edu. I'd be very happy to follow up with online conversation. So maybe I could start with a question. How much parental leave does Brazil offer? In the United States, it's minimal, which ironically is responsible for less discrimination by firms against women because there's no obligation to pay, which is why you get that negative slope in the relationship between women in parliament and women in government. These things are just not related except in a negative way. But how about in Brazil?
Who wants to answer that question? How many months or days Brazilian legislation ensures to women for parental leave? Who knows that? It's 4 months, 120 days, exactly. But it's very asymmetric towards men who only have 5 days as a parental leave. Some private companies extend the parental leave for women to up to 6 months, but it's not that common and it's not binding. So the standard is 120 days.
Mm-hmm.
And no preoccupation or concern with replacing costs at all in Brazil. We never heard about this. Not at least I never heard about this before. I don't know if someone knows something else about this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and just completing, if you are what we call the Empresa Cidadã, which is a program that the companies can be part of, the leave for men, for the fathers, can be until 20 days, not that much, but from 5 to 20, it's a little bit more, but still a huge gap between men and women.
Right. Well, so the expectation then is that firms will avoid hiring women. That does represent a pretty substantial difference in cost.
Absolutely. That's the type of calculation that companies certainly do in Brazil, no doubt.
Mm-hmm.
Frances, just taking the same path that you brought to this discussion, do you believe that when we have, like the USA, that we are more flexible with these things because we have more women because we don't have the maternity leave obligation? Do you think that this is important as well, or should we have a more concrete policy that focus also on parents and also on men taking the leave together? And if the second option is what seems to be the best one, how do you see that countries can have the money and to fund this kind of parent leave?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So it does require taxpayer money, and it requires taxpayers to trust the government to spend taxpayer money in a good way. So if the trust in government is low because of corruption, it's very, very difficult to get a policy like that. In the United States, the Republican Party has really focused on trying to reduce trust in government, and that's where states' rights come from. And this is a little bit off topic, but in the United States, there's there's very little national spending on schools. It's all done locally by property tax, which means that we have very unequal schools by neighborhood. And this means that we have class-based education in the United States as a result. So when there is low trust in government, there is low ability to raise the taxes to do what many people would like if they could be sure it's there, but they just don't believe or trust that the government will supply it. Beatrice.
I have a question. Yeah. Hello. Thank you very much for the keynote. It was amazing. I think based on what you said, there are quite a bit of space to reform in the US. I would be curious to know whether you think the new administration has any proposals or aware of any changes that are going to be introduced with the new administration, and if so, to which extent they would address some of the issues that you discussed today. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I would like to be very optimistic. I think it will be better than Trump, who was a very irresponsible person. The difficulty in the US political system is that partly because of the way the United States formed as an oppositional group of colonies to Britain, the Constitution puts in place a lot of checks and balances, which makes it hard for any government to do anything. And if Biden does not get a majority in the Senate will block most reforms. So I don't expect very much to happen. I think on the environment, he will be able to use presidential powers, but I don't expect much. Certainly nothing like what we've discussed. ECEC, infrastructural spending, that is very hard to do because it requires taxes, and I think it'll be minimal change. Mariana, did you say something?
Yes, I do. It's kind of related to Beatrice's question, but you were talking a lot about how strong parties produce better policies. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think the impact of a very diverse Democratic Party with people such as Biden, AOC, Bernie Sanders, what is that impact in terms of policies, especially with what you talked about, the environment or healthcare, stuff like that?
Right. Well, I think they have basic agreement on healthcare and environment. So I think those things will certainly be more stable than they have been under Trump. But you put your finger, I think, on a very important thing, which is that when there is a lot of diversity within a party, and then the question is, why is it so diverse? The pictures I showed you, the safe seats, I think are the answer to that. When the districts look very different from each other, they choose people who don't agree with other people in the same party. They have a hard time moving policy very far in any direction. So, the whole system really is designed for gridlock. And we get it. Beatrice.
Can I just follow up on everything you just said in Mariana's question as well? We were discussing before with the students that are part of the economic law course, how the lenses of political economy to understand gender inequality and how structural change leads to diminishing the gap between genders. I was wondering what would be your perspective in that regard, if from a more pragmatic perspective, this kind of short-term changes are unlikely to happen in the current system in the US, and I think I would say the same in Brazil. If anything, we're moving in the wrong direction, the opposite direction. What kind of more, from again, a political economy of gender inequality lenses, what would you think would be a way forward, both in your current situation and maybe if you could reflect a bit on Brazil as well? Okay.
Well, you'll have to tell me more about Brazil. I know that it's a presidential system with open list primaries, so I think it's very hard for parties to be programmatic and long-term. And there's a lot of research in Sweden where the data are easily available for what happens to the quality of politicians when there's a lot of bottom-up versus more consensual party decision-making. Political economy is a big umbrella that encompasses three major approaches. One is materialist conditions, and on those grounds, women are doing better now. That is, when we've moved from the manufacturing-based economy to more service-based economy, there are fewer barriers to female success than before, except at the very top of the income ladder, where the expectation in management, law, finance is for people to be available around the clock. And so women have a systematic disadvantage as long as they are and/or are expected to take care of children during some of those times. So from a materialist point of view, the service sector is an engine of female employment, but it doesn't get us all the way there because time is money in the upper reaches of the economy. Do you follow me? The second approach in political economy is institutions, and how government is organized has a big bearing on what kinds of policies they can offer to solve market failures or to nudge away from the time is money kind of structure. And the third is culture or ideas or maybe even evolutionarily based preference structures. This is behavioral economics, prospect theory. The idea is people, maybe men in particular, have more backlash against females because of loss aversion, which is an evolutionarily built-in self-protective mechanism. This is the Thinking Fast and Slow. I'm sure you've heard of that book. So political economy is, offers very wide range of approaches to thinking about gender, and none of them offers a silver bullet. There are obstacles in the way of every single one of these possible ways forward. And some research shows that there's nothing short of real mobilization around issues led by people who feel those issues strongly, and are willing to bang their heads against walls for quite a long time.
Frances, I have a more abstract or maybe theoretical question. When you tell us that political economy is about materialism or a materialist pillar and an institutional pillar, and also it's about culture and ideas, what comes to our mind is that law is there in the three senses, right? Because law is behind institutions, law is somehow embedded in the fabric of society. It's also informal law, if you consider not only formal law or black letter law, and it's also somehow embedded in culture and ideas. So this comes to our mind as a claim according to which there is a lot of law embedded in political economy, and therefore there is a lot of law embedded in gender policies, because gender policies are related to the big umbrella of political economy. Political economy usually is something that ends up resulting in policies. And therefore, my question is, to what extent do you see that there is an established or mature dialogue between political economists and political scientists such as you and lawyers, in a sense that lawyers can realize that there is a lot that they can do especially when it comes to policy implementation, to improve this kind of to fix the blind spots, to fix the bottlenecks, and to reduce the asymmetries between men and women when it comes to gender policies. The reason why I'm asking this is that in Brazil, in the Brazilian legal scholarship at least, there is no theoretical connection whatsoever that relates law and political economy. And the more we move, the more we discuss this topic in discourse, particularly, the more we realize that this connection is very important, not only from the theoretical viewpoint, but also for very practical reasons. Would you agree with this? How do you see this disciplinary relationship between law and political economy and political science?
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's a very close relationship. And in the United States, for example, at the Yale Law School, there is a law and economics group, which is based in political economy. But then there are also many other research groups that touch on political economy one way or another, as you said. So law has to be passed by legislatures, and in that sense, it's political, but then it's interpreted in the courts. And you probably know that the US Supreme Court has just shifted its balance from being roughly even between left, right to being 6 conservative, 3 liberal. And this, the political economy of law in the United States is going to be very much affected by that, in the sense that the legislature will be reluctant to leave difficult questions to the courts in the way that they were used to doing. You probably also know a lot of the theorizing about, what are the conditions under which law is independent of politics. And this is a very lively field of research, but one very influential point of view is that politicians often don't like to deal with difficult problems, and they will punt, and they will prefer to have a legal system with integrity when there's the expectation of alternation of parties in power. It's very convenient to control the courts as long as your party can be sure that you can control all the judges. But if there's any thought that the other party might use the courts against you, that becomes a nightmare. So there is a preference for judicial independence when there's alternation in politics. So that's just one way that the political economy of the law has these many different facets. You can't really pull them apart in the way that the 3 pillars. They're really more like a braid, but analytically it's interesting to see which one of these is moving at any one time.
Vitória?
So thank you so much for the discussion you're providing us today. My question is regarding a bit of the cultural sense here in Brazil, because we have a very different perspective when you're talking about higher class and higher educated people, and how they see gender inequality, and how people who don't have a lot of access to these types of debate we're having right now. And the conversation about gender inequality, it doesn't get to many places here in Brazil where you don't have a lot of education, and it's not actually seen as a problem. And we have a very long way to go for the general public to see it as a problem. And considering that situation, how could we make this a topic so relevant for the overall population, and by political means and also legal means? Because many times if we do take actions and the people, they don't see this movement as legitimate, it may be just enforced on them, and it may not be seen as good. And my example for this is mainly our government right now. This discussion about gender inequality, it is seen as just an ideology movement that has no good results coming from it, and it shouldn't be applied or taught at school, and shouldn't be discussed, and we shouldn't have laws addressing these types of things. And that is a perception of our government right now, and a perception also of some sectors of our society. But how can we also improve this agenda if we have this obstacle in our public debate?
That's a really hard question. We thought we would not survive Trump, but we did. Maybe that should give you some hope. Even though Bolsonaro's government is not favorable towards gender equality, I'm sure there are a lot of people in society who are. So I would just say be patient, and also think about the different ways that gender equality can move forward. So one is through more equality in the workplace. The expansion of the service sector is very favorable towards women, because there are fewer reasons why women are not as good at these tasks. And as more women are in the labor force, the bargaining power within the family begins to shift, which changes the whole culture and attitudes towards their daughters. If there's a high demand for female labor, parents who care about their children will invest in their daughters more equally as in their sons, rather than only preparing their sons for the labor market. So these are slow changes that can happen alongside the political mobilization. So I would say don't give up hope and think of all the angles. Just as your professor said, there are, these are related and in many complicated ways. They don't all happen together.
Thank you.
Frances, we have a colleague here who's Professor Raquel Pimenta from FGV, which is great that she's here. She wants to, would you like to ask a question, Raquel?
Thank you, Diogo. Thank you, Professor. This was a very interesting talk and lecture. I was wondering if legal design is a variable in maybe on the parental leave question, that graphic you showed of the Scandinavian countries, that some countries were not even on, well, men were not even taking 10 or 20% of the parental leave available. I was wondering if legal design was maybe one of the explanations, in the sense that in some countries it is mandated that they take a certain minimum, and in others it is not. It is based on incentives or other forms of trying to get men to take the parental leave. And I was wondering if you have an opinion on those kind of designs, if they make a difference. And because finally, as I understand, the ultimate equalizer would be for both men and women to take 50% of the parental leave, or some form in the overall number, right? It doesn't matter the particular family's decision. So I was wondering if you have any opinion on that front.
Well, I think your intuition is absolutely right, that the nudge should be to have an opt-out system rather than opt-in. I don't know if it's in how many countries is it legally possible to mandate parental leave, but surely it's constitutionally palatable to make it easier for fathers to take leave than it is currently. And so then the question is, how can the government actually pass this kind of legislation? So there are layers and layers of complexity, but I think you're right that the legislation should make it natural that fathers take leave, and costly if they don't. And I wonder if you have any ideas how that could be passed in Brazil, for example.
If I can follow up really quickly, I think we have opted for a tax-based system, and I'm no expert, but I wonder if this is the best solution, because finally it gives a lot of leeway for companies not to adhere or not to follow the, this kind of tax induction. I don't know.
The tax-based system means that the firms do or don't have to follow the same rules?
As I understand, and maybe if someone knows this better, it's just that we have by constitution 120 days for the mother, and then it can be extended through what Carolina explained of this. Basically, it's a tax deduction system to 180 days. And for the father, that means it can be extended from 5 days to 20 days. And this is, I think it's also interesting, because it's trying to induce men through the tax system of the company. And I wonder if we don't need individual incentives in place too. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you're on the right track, that institutional design and incentive nudges are very important, and that sometimes there are unintended consequences. Giving females more leave than males sounds like it should be okay, but actually it just increases the statistical discrimination against females. And so the public, in the form of tax subsidies or taxes in the direction, nudging in the direction they want society to go, is important. But it's hard to get the government to agree to do that. So that's why there has to be, you have to proceed on multiple levels at once, mobilizing for change.
Thank you, Frances, again. Thank you, Raquel. I think we have time for a last question. It's from Leticia. I think she has, would you like to ask questions still, Leticia? Or
Professor,
do
I
you
have
feel...
one question. Can I take Leticia's place? Oh, sorry. Go on.
Ok, depois você vai, então. First of all, I would like to thank you for the enriching lecture. And my question, I think I can understand why the maternity leave generates many costs to the private and public initiative, because it prevents these resources from being used in a more profitable way. And that's one of the reasons why women who decides to have children have way less chances than the other ones. However, and I'm sorry if that sounds a little stupid, but I'd like to know if there is a real practical solution for this terrible problem, because the scenario is quite discouraging, and I find myself thinking about it all the time.
I don't think there's a fast solution other than going to your company and showing your company your sterilization papers. And that's unfair. You shouldn't have to do that. The longer term solution is to make sure that the government is interested in gender equality in the long run. And that requires taking the problem seriously. So you need to actually have people elected in office who care about it. And, you know, you can't do that overnight. And then get the law courts to rule in favor. That also requires having politicians appoint lawyers who will make those good judgments. So there are many, many layers to it at once.
Thank you so much.
Natalia, I think we have time for a last one. Can we have a last one, Frances?
First of all, thank you so much for your lecture. And you posed the question about the persistence of the gender pay gaps in the Nordic countries, even though well, at least here we see those countries as some sort of role model and just development in general and gender policies. And I'm not sure if I missed part of the discussion. If I did, I'm sorry, but how would you answer this question? And one other thing that I heard about these countries, actually about Sweden, is that it has the highest rape cases per capita in the world, if not the highest, one of the highest. And I've heard this a couple of years ago, but it really shocked me because I'd expected to have one of the lowest.
Yeah.
And yeah, how would you try to answer this question? Do you think it's just misogyny, purely cultural? Do you think the government policies themselves reinforce that system, or maybe that the data is wrong?
Yeah, let me talk to your second point first. Women in gender equal countries like Sweden are more willing to report rape. They're more willing to report all kinds of sexual harassment. They're more able to see sexual harassment at very subtle levels. So I'm doing a study on sexual harassment in Japan where it's prevalent, but women try to ignore it because they can't afford to take it as seriously as in Sweden. So that's what I would say. Sexual harassment exists everywhere, but the numbers don't mean the same thing because self-reporting reflects a different calculation about whether it's worth reporting. And on the first point, Scandinavia does have better policies than almost any other part of the world, but there are unintended consequences of generous parental leave. As long as women take more than men, firms will avoid hiring and promoting women. And so it's not until the government, or that is the taxpayer, is willing to provide replacement costs that there will be complete equality, even in Scandinavia.
All right, thank you, Frances.
So I think we don't have further questions. So if you don't mind, or we will end the event. I'd like to say our thank you. Frances, it was a pleasure having you here, sharing so much knowledge with us. And I hope that we have other opportunities to have you talking with us about this topic that is so important, and there are so many other specific topics inside it that we can discuss. So thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it a lot.
Thank you so much, Frances. This was excellent. This was great, very enlightening. Thank you very much again.
Next time in Brazil. Or come to
next
this
time in Brazil. That's
come to Yale.
Okay.
Bye.
By the way, Frances, I don't know if you saw, but there is a group called Law and Political Economy at Yale, which is not the same as law and economics. They're actually critical to law and economics. Very interesting people doing this kind of stuff at Yale. So we can send you something if you want to know more about this. It's Professor Amy Kapinski.
Okay.
But anyway, thank you so much again.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much.
Bye bye, thank you.
Bye. E obrigada a todos que participaram aqui.
Muito obrigado, pessoal. Um bom dia a todas e a todos e até o nosso próximo evento do Grupo Direito e Políticas Públicas. Um abraço para vocês todas e todos e obrigado mais uma vez pela presença hoje. Até logo.